Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me to deliver this talk on my absolute favourite subject of all, our fantastic urban flora, specifically in my wonderful home city of Newcastle. Let's get going. So, before talking a little bit more about what I've been up to, I wanted to introduce Newcastle itself. What exactly is it? Well, here you see the boundaries of my survey area. It's actually the Newcastle City Council boundary. As you can see, it's quite a big area and quite a diverse one too. You have everything from the depths of inner city urban habitats in the south here up to some slightly more rural ones in the north. But don't be fooled at all by the amount of green you see on this map. No part of Newcastle is natural. It's an entirely artificial landscape, one which has been completely changed by man. And all of this, of course, has a real impact on the plants you find here. Over the next few slides, I wanted to give a whistle-stop tour of the flora in Newcastle. Let's take a closer look. So first, some background. What exactly have I been up to? Well, simply put, I've been writing a flora, largely inspired by the wonderful studies you see here in urban areas of Nottingham and Belfast. I divvied the area you saw previously up into 123 monads and have been visiting multiple times in all seasons to record the wild and naturalised plants found there. Only wild and naturalised plants. It's an important separation there. And simply put, it's been quite a big task. Not easy to fit into life when you're working full time, and I think I'll be at this for quite a while yet. But hopefully, in the end, no alleyway, car park, or messy roadside verge will be left unsurveyed. So, kicking us off, we have the best habitat for urban botany, paradise for plant enthusiasts, our wasteland. Now, wasteland plots can be exceptionally diverse depending on their makeup and can possess very distinctive plant communities. But for me, those three species shown here really do embody this habitat. Some are exceptionally common. Meliotus albus, white meliot, is a really good example of this and really does thrive on inner city building sites, including in the heart of the city centre, wherever buildings have been demolished or car parks dug up. Similarly, yellowwort, Blackstonia, is a very common plant across wasteland areas in Newcastle, so much so that it can actually be one of the most numerous flowering plants in any such area. What is quite interesting about this is the further north you go in Northumberland, this species becomes quite scarce. So Newcastle and the sort of urban plots where it is found really do represent its epicenter in the region. And of course, not all plants are common here. Some are far scarcer, but increasing. Haresfoot clover, a really lovely plant, is a nice example here. And despite being quite scarce, is invariably associated with waste ground plots in the city, particularly those with thin soils and perhaps an element of rubble in there too. Running between Newcastle's industrial and municipal areas, the city is bisected by a great many rail lines, or metro lines as we call them here. We're not so graced to have that many train tracks in the northeast. The sidings and banks associated with these habitats are really quite interesting on account of limited footfall, no management, and in many cases, they've been left to develop a really unique scrub community consisting of a great many bird-sown alien shrubs. There are too many out there to choose from. Notable examples include garden privet and pyracantha, but for me, it is the cotoneastas which really embody this habitat. I've picked on Cotoneaster francettae here as it genuinely is one of the commonest, but really there are a lot more out there. Sticking with our rail lines, Buddleia davidii needs very little introduction and is a well-known species of our rail links. I daren't think how much Network Rail spends on trying to eradicate the species each year. And it really is one which you either love or you hate. I'm not quite sure where I fall, actually. But these habitats can also hold other plants too. And Persian ivy, shown here as the attractive cultivar sulphur heart, is becoming a very common sight in these scrubby sidings, usually having escaped areas of amenity planting nearby. I suspect this is one we'll be seeing a lot more of over the years to come. Sticking with transport routes now, and we have our inhospitable roadsides, the domain of the halophytes, the salt lovers. Now, whilst recording for this flora, I've recorded around about 10 species of typically coastal plant growing along the city's roads. Some of these are rather scarce, species such as sea aster, for example, but others are far more common. Danish scurvy grass, a really familiar plant of our roadsides, is incredibly widespread and paints pavements and gutters a really pretty colour when it blooms en masse. Now, other plants haven't quite reached this level yet, but are increasing. The two plantain species shown here are perhaps the best examples. Buckshorn plantain in particular does very well on the short-cropped grass verges within reach of the salt spray generated by passing cars, and is definitely a plant on the rise in Newcastle. Sea plantain is altogether more scarce, but is popping up now on roundabouts and grassy verges if you get on your hands and knees to look for it among the sward. One of Newcastle's most famous transport links now, and we have the mighty River Tyne. Now, dare I say that no part of the Tyne is natural. Over centuries, it has been altered beyond recognition by leisure and particularly industry. It is an unnatural river. All of these changes mean that our native flora has, for the large part, been either extirpated or consigned to small pockets of suitable habitat along the river. And for me, one really good example of this is wild celery, Apium graveolens. This is a rare plant register species in VC67. It's a rather rare plant, but does very well in the sort of muddy pockets and particularly seawall habitats along the river, even sort of 4 miles inland towards Newburn in the west of the city. Of course, aliens have found their niche here too, and these habitats, like our rail lines, are notable for their scrubby communities, as you will see here in the top corner. Often these occur close to industrial estates and sort of ornamental beds. So the species that occur here are often ones which have hopped the fence, so to speak, and Cotoneaster lacteus, shown here, is a very good example. At the time of recording this one at Ellswick at Newcastle's quayside, this was actually the first record for VC67, but I've since found it at several sites along the river in sort of scrubby wasteland pockets and sea defences. Into some truly urban habitats now, and who doesn't love a good pavement plant? Credit where credit is due, these are some of our hardiest urban plants. They're tough as nails and some of my favourites. Now, Newcastle's pavements hold a very distinctive flora consisting largely of neophytes such as Oxford ragwort, shown here, and others like red valerian. But others are on the increase. Mind your own business is an interesting little plant and is a frequent component of our pavement flora on the shaded side of streets, often tucked in at the base of walls or in gutters or actually at the base of houses where they meet concrete. More recently, it has been joined by water bent. Now, the story of this tenacious little grass is very well known. It is certainly on the march across the UK, but in Newcastle is only just consolidating itself. But almost on a month-by-month basis, I'm noticing this in new streets, new alleys, and new corners of the city. It certainly looks set to become one of our commonest urban grasses. Often running adjacent to areas of pavement, we have our city's delightfully weedy front gardens. And can I just say now, thank the Lord for students who don't like their gardening. The gardens, typically in terrace neighbourhoods, can be exceptionally diverse, and whilst it might be a little bit controversial to botanise gardens, can often yield some quite exciting results. Some species are almost invariably found in front gardens. Welsh poppy is a great example of one of these specialists and is abundant across gravel driveways and patios citywide. Indeed, on account of its rather attractive flowers, I believe it probably gets left by gardeners who are in doing so inadvertently aiding its spread. An interesting component of Newcastle's garden flora, however, that is also on the increase is pale pink sorrel, Oxalis incarnata. This is actually becoming a bit of a pest on my street in Heaton, a suburb of the city, and is now moving between front gardens via bulbils distributed in discarded compost or garden waste. It's on the verge of becoming a bit of a pest, actually, and I suspect could become problematic for gardeners in the future. And of course, I couldn't resist including this photo here of Natural History Society members Prue and Jane exploring a front garden in Heaton. We do get up to some funny things as botanists. Some more unusual plants now, and in Newcastle we are blessed with an assortment of large parks and green spaces, several of which, including Jesmond shown down here to the bottom, have their roots in the private estates of Victorians. And many were managed as naturalistic gardens. As you might expect, this involved the planting of a great many alien species. Things such as rhododendron and acuba are good examples. But one I always like to mention is the beautiful salmonberry shown here with its vivid pink flowers. This is a really quite lovely plant and hasn't shown itself too invasive, but despite this, a rather large patch exists in Jesmond, and the sort of romanticist inside me would like to think it was planted by Lord Armstrong, who created the plants way back at the parks way back in the 1800s. It does make for a fine sight in spring. Other additions to the parks are more recent, occurring as garden escapes, and of these, Arometallicum is becoming one of the more widespread, particularly in shaded hedgerows and areas of dense cover alongside waterways. Another quick note on parks here, and I couldn't resist sharing this oddball. This is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is doing exceedingly well in two portions of Jesmond, always growing sort of on these banks beside watercourses in very heavy shade. And I dare say becoming quite invasive where it persists to the detriment of native ground flora. The flowers are attractive, but this perhaps might be one which in a few years we have to reassess. With so many parks, Newcastle also has its fair share of ornamental ponds and lakes. And as ever in damp places, all of these come with their own unique and quite interesting flora. Of the native species found in these habitats, gypsywort is one which I've come to associate with the sort of stony margins of typically highly urban ponds, where it occurs in sort of embankments, pavements, and stonework. Believe it or not, this is actually another RPR species in VC67, but it's one which is increasing tenfold in the sort of densest urban habitats. The city's submerged aquatic flora is a little less diverse, and I'm only just starting to scratch the surface now of what is actually to be found here. And I will say that you do get some funny looks exploring inner city parks armed with a grapnel on a Sunday morning. People do think you've gone a little bit mad, but in doing so, you do find some interesting plants. And one of the ones I see most often is actually rigid hornwort, which doesn't really seem to show a preference for sort of highly urbanized lakes or natural ponds. The most interesting thing about our city's parkland lakes, however, has to be the sort of large increase in birdseed aliens wherever anyone feeds the ducks and swans. A great many species can be found as casuals in these habitats, things such as amaranthus, canary grass, sunflower, and niger. but one which seems to be doing very well, and indeed, for the first time this year, I think, persisting over winter, is ragweed. Um, Add to this a whole host of other oddities, and our lakesides can make for a really interesting place to botanize. When talking about ponds, it seemed only right to share this funny sighting. For the last 3 years, at least, a rather large example of marshmallow has been flowering by a small pond in Iris Brickfield Park in Heaton, close to my house. At the time of stumbling across this was actually a new county record, and I would love to know how it got there. This is one of those plants that poses more questions than it answers, really. Was it a garden escape, an accidental introduction, or was it introduced when the other marginals were planted around the pond, perhaps by mistake, perhaps not? Who knows? Now we've covered the habitats, I thought I would whiz through a few other aspects of our urban flora. The first being the species on the increase in the city. Most of these, as you might expect, are neophytes, and are included here are two of the most prominent examples. Where once it was a rather rare plant locally, narrow-leaved ragwort, an introduction from South Africa, is now following in the footsteps of Oxford ragwort to become one of our most abundant pavement plants in select neighbourhoods. And similarly, Italian alder is on the rise too. This is an interesting one in that we are continually introducing Italian alder in Newcastle to this day. We seem to love to plant it as an ornamental tree along streets, I think because it grows upwards instead of outward into the path of passing cars. But regardless, these trees set huge quantities of seed and pop up just about anywhere in pavements, gardens, and of course in those scrubby railway sidings we talked about earlier. It's definitely one to watch. Now, two more I simply had to mention, and indeed I had to get Cotoneastas in again. These are well, perhaps my favorite group of plants of all. Some of you might call that Stockholm syndrome, but I've now identified around 16 species of Cotoneasta growing wild in Newcastle. But two of the most obvious and indeed common are these two, the willow-leaved Cotoneasta, Cotoneasta salicifolius, and bolete Cotoneasta, Cotoneasta reederi. Both of these do particularly well in scrubby, neglected areas, and particularly the salicifolius, which likes things a little bit more parched in sort of former industrial areas with lots of concrete, rubble. And this is just an example of some of the little maps I've been creating for my own personal enjoyment during the course of writing this. This is the map for willow-leaved Cotoneasta. And as you can see, it shows a really strong bias to more southerly areas of the city, which anecdotally are those with higher level of urbanisation. They are more built up. The good news in the city, at least for botanists, is that it's not just the aliens on the increase. Our native plants are at it too, and these two are perhaps the best examples. Small scabious is a really interesting one in that in the northeast is quite a rare plant associated with calcareous habitats, particularly in County Durham. What is interesting is that it is popping up in more and more squares within urban Newcastle, largely on roadside verges where seed mixes have been applied atop a sort of former industrial calcareous soils. This seems to be the main avenue for this plant colonising the city, but it isn't alone in that regard. And other examples include greater knapweed and indeed chalk knapweed, Centaurea deboxi, which, despite not being recorded here at all a few years ago, is actually showing itself to be far more widespread than we first thought. And we had to mention bee orchid. Now, this species is on the rise across the UK. It is advancing north at a lightning pace. I think it's now reached Scotland, hasn't it? But in Newcastle, it is still fairly new. Despite that, records of bee orchid are increasing year on year. And just this year, I actually recorded it from the heart of the city centre on the sort of over-managed lawn outside of Newcastle Civic Centre. It gets everywhere, and I dare say will become possibly our most abundant orchid in the next few years. Of course, while botanizing any location, you have the plants which fill you with delight, the ones which make you do a little dance whenever you stumble across them. And in Newcastle, we're spoiled for choice, but the plants shown here are those which stay with me. June hellebrine thrives on former industrial land close to the Tyne at Newburn, and really is present in abundance at some plots, particularly under the cover of birch trees. While coral root orchid, Corallariza trifida, is known from the Natural History Society's Gosforth Nature Reserve on the outskirts of the city, where it inhabits sort of wet birch woodland on the peripheries of the site's lake. Quite the change from the sandy dunes of Lindisfarne, which is at this time is still the only other place I've seen this orchid in the area. And finally, we have the surprises, plants occurring in funny places, the plants you don't expect to encounter, but are happy that you did. And when it comes to the unexpected, often it's the neophytes which give the biggest surprises. Cabbage thistle to the top here was recently discovered in Armstrong Park by fellow botanist Prue Hammond. And again, poses questions about how exactly it got there. Had it been unnoticed since Victorian times? Was it a more recent escape? Who knows? The same questions can't be said about curry plant shown down the bottom here. This occurs on my local high street in Heaton, where it is seeded from sort of planted raised beds dotted along the street. And of course, I couldn't resist sharing this lovely northern marsh orchid here. This one went a little bit of viral thanks to BSBI when I shared it on Twitter, and really did make for quite a surprise when I encountered it on a slightly hungover morning walk a few years ago, growing in the pavement and gutter of that same street you see there with the curry plant. For me, it is just a testament to the fact that plants get everywhere, and it pays to expect the unexpected when botanizing in the city. So where are we at now? That was a whistle-stop tour of our urban flora, but things are continuing. Just in terms of summarising the survey so far, I've now recorded over 810 species, subspecies and hybrids within the city limits. Of these, a slightly daunting 40% are neophytes, human introductions. So far, I've spent around about 200 hours, generated about 9,000 records, but the work isn't done yet. At this rate, slotting things in on weekends, I think I'll be done around about early 2025. And of course, look out for the plants of Newcastle, hopefully coming soon in a physical form you can hold. But of course, I will have to see if I can get some support to make that happen. And just on this slide here, a great big thank you to my wonderful partner and indeed partner in crime, Matt, who, despite claiming that he doesn't like botany, that he's not into plants, accompanies me on most of these outings, and was even caught here looking at least a bit happy, admiring some bee orchids on a roundabout outside of our local B&Q in Scotswood. Got him. And last but not least, a huge thank you to everyone who is now getting out there and generating records associated with our urban flora. Botany is better when carried out in great company, and I really am very grateful for everyone who has accompanied me on trips, courses, events, and casual walks over the last year and a bit. All of these photos here were taken on Natural History Society trips, and it is just so wonderful to see many more people sending in records. So just a big thank you. And a big thank you to you too. Thank you for listening to me waffle on about our urban plants. And a special big thank you to the botanists at NHSN and BSBI who have supported me over the last few years. I only started botanizing around about 4 years ago. It's been quite the journey so far, but I am so grateful for the support, guidance of local Vice County recorders and indeed of others too. Yes, that's it from me. If you'd like to stay in touch, give me a follow, and thank you very much once again.